Welcome to Utilizing Tech, the podcast about emerging technology from Gestalt IT. This season of Utilizing Tech focuses on edge computing, which demands a new approach to compute, storage, networking, and more. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT. Joining me today as my co-host is Alastair Cooke. Welcome, Al.
Hey, Stephen. Nice to be back talking to you today.
It is great having you from the other side of the world. Now, we both got into IT a while ago, and we've both seen quite a lot of water go under that bridge. It's interesting. Edge is quite a bit different from data center or cloud IT, don't you think?
I think it draws from both of them, and that it is definitely, you can't just transplant from either of those locations and expect everything to work the same at the edge. But fundamentally, we come back to what is the business problem you're trying to solve, and how can we do that with the least effort and least risk?
And yet, some things in enterprise tech, some of the data center concepts that you and I have spent our whole career working on, things like high availability and continuous availability, that's a little bit more difficult to accomplish. And some people, I think, are maybe throwing up their hands and saying, I'm not sure that we can have this. Maybe in edge environments, we need to make things disposable and run it on a single node instead of multi-node or things like that. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think there's a mix in here. Is there are some very cost-conscious places where there really isn't valuable data or services that are really critical, where an outage of 5 minutes, an hour, a week is inconvenient, but it's not business critical. But I think there are some edge use cases where that does become really critical. Imagine you have an outage at your favorite gas station, and you can't fill up for a week. That seems like a problem. I mean, even not being able to get service for 5 minutes is probably going to lead customers to go to a different station. And so there can be some business impact, even at the places that we think of as being relatively low cost, low valuable data, but actually the service delivery there is important.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I need my Slurpee and my hot dog too. I mean, don't forget that. But one of the things that occurs to me is that one of the reasons that we don't have some of these things, I think people would want high availability at the edge. I think it's just too hard to achieve in some cases. It takes too much hardware, too much software, too much cost. And I think that that's the reason that some people aren't implementing it. But that's what we're going to talk about today on Utilizing Edge. Our guest today is an old friend of mine, Bruce Kornfeld, who is Chief Marketing and Product Officer at StorMagic. And one of the things about StorMagic is that they're trying to tackle this high availability question at the edge. So welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to a lively chat.
Well, it's always a lively chat with you. And I am really interested in diving into this because like I said, one of the challenges for high availability is the idea that you need to have basically redundant hardware, and redundant hardware is expensive. So if I tell you need to have 3 nodes instead of 2, or if I tell you need to buy 33% more storage, 33% more memory, 33% more everything, that's a huge problem when it's multiplied by 1,000 nodes, right?
Yeah, listen, at StorMagic, this is, we talk to customers about this all the time. And a lot of times they just cannot cost justify the extra hardware and software needed to achieve the high availability. And they work with their organization to say, sorry, you know what, we can't, the budget isn't there. So we're going to have a single node. We're going to have a single server. And if that thing goes down, here's the impact. There's going to be downtime for 4 hours, a day, a couple days, don't know, but there are cases that have to go that route. But we're seeing a lot of cases the other way, that because technology is becoming less expensive, there are ways of achieving both.
I think there's a really interesting piece also around efficient use of the storage, because there are a few solutions around that do this cluster of servers and turning local storage into shared storage, which is the most cost-effective way of doing this. But some of them put quite a lot of overhead. And of course, the same story as having that extra third node, having an extra 20% of resources in every server that you've got at 10,000 sites, that gets to be really expensive. So I think there's a need for solutions that actually fit to the small scale.
Yeah, typically what we're seeing is that a lot of IT professionals are they're used to what they've worked on in the past, which is typically they built a big data center or a small data center that has dozens, hundreds, thousands of servers and lots of storage. And when you and the inclination is let's just do the same thing at the edge, and that's a big problem because typically you need at least three servers. And yeah, using the internal storage, that's the whole software defined storage thing, and there's a lot of solutions for that out there, and they all do it fine, and they all provide the high availability. But typically, it requires at least three, sometimes four, in order to ensure that a node can go down. So a lot of times it comes down to the cost equation and the management bit because typically these data center designed software defined storage, HCI, use the flavor of word that you want, but they're designed for big enterprise, and the edge presents a lot of challenges that make those solutions hard to fit. And mostly it's cost. I mean, it really comes down to cost.
Yeah, that's my feeling too. It really is comes down to cost because I mean, a lot of people listening here, you might not be storage nerds. I'm a storage nerd, but if I say RAID to you, the first thing you're probably thinking of is waste. That's extremely expensive. Extreme, oh, I got to buy twice as much. I got to buy three times as much. If I say high availability, the first thing you're going to think of is waste. Oh, I got to buy multiple systems. I got to buy multiple servers. I got to ship them all out there. I got to power them. I got to keep them running, and they're not doing anything. Why do I have to have all this wasted, idle hardware out there just in case something goes wrong? And honestly, as much as it pains me as a data center guy to say this, you're not wrong about that. RAID is overhead. It is waste. High availability, having an extra system out there, it absolutely is. And you need to think about that. You need to think about the cost, and you need to think about the benefit of deploying this stuff and whether it's worth it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, the way completely agree. And a lot of customers still they cost justify it. It makes sense for their business to have the RAID. I mean, RAID is very, very common, as you know. But the good news there is the cost of the physical storage has come down so much that yep, instead of three drives, we're going to have to buy four or five. Um, but that cost isn't a major one. It becomes more significant when you're talking about another whole node, a whole nother server with five drives in it, et cetera. Um, the technology that we deliver that helps on this case is to allow for a two-node solution instead of three. Most everyone else requires three, and that's a huge cost when you have dozens, hundreds, or thousands of sites. And the technology is just it's kind of simple. Al, you and I have talked about in the past, but it's a remote witness, and a lot of because you still need three nodes in order to have a proper HA solution, and that I think that's a I don't think the topic of this is to argue that down to the bottom, but I'm pretty sure that most IT people would agree that you need three to have a very highly available cluster or quorum.
So that's, I think, that the key that, again, to the IT audience that we have, I think that it's important to understand, yes, if you have a cluster of, well, if you have a cluster of one node, then you don't have a cluster, I guess. You have a node, and if it goes down, it goes down. If you have a cluster of two nodes and you run everything on one of them, and if it dies, then it runs on the other one, that's all well and good, but it's really hard to make that highly available because what happens if you snip the connection between those two nodes and both of them think that they are the node? That's when things go wrong. And that's what Bruce is talking about here. The reason that we IT people always say you need three nodes is exactly that. They call it a split brain or something like that, where essentially you've got two nodes that used to be coordinating and now are no longer coordinating, and both of them are like, I'm in charge here, Alexander Haig, and they're all running off saying, hey, listen to me, I'm doing my thing, I'm making the decisions. And that's a big problem because things can get corrupted. You can have torn database accesses, for example. You can have a client that's talking to this one and thinks that he's just charged my Slurpee, and this other one is like, nope, no Slurpee here, and suddenly you're losing money. It's a huge problem, and that's why most cases you can't have a 2-node cluster. You need a 3-node cluster. And again, that's the thing that StorMagic is focused on. That's the thing that a lot of companies are focused on, trying to figure out how can we not have to have 3 nodes.
Yeah, there are technologies in order to do that without putting that third node on every single site, and that's where, that's where we've architected our software-defined storage solution has been architected for this environment for the edge. In that we designed it so you don't need that third node on site. You can have the third node in the cloud. You can have the third node in your data center, and the way that it basically works is it's a simple little VM that acts as the third node for lots of sites, up up to 1,000 sites for one little VM. So that acts as a node for quorum for up to 1,000 clusters, and that's simply how we do it. And it is pretty amazing what we hear from customers, because they, when they hear about our solution, they're blown away that, oh, so I can do this with 2. It's reliable. I do get the real HA with proper quorum. I just don't have to invest in that third physical server, and that's pretty much the way it works.
I think there's another aspect to that I really want to highlight is the one-to-many relationship between the central resource and the clusters. Because a lot of the data center solutions that have been adapted to remote office, branch office use case, you have one-to-one kind of mappings. And that works just fine if you've got half a dozen or a dozen sites. But when you're getting to hundreds and thousands of sites, that mapping of a witness that's a one-to-many becomes absolutely crucial. I don't want to have to run 10,000 witness VMs in my data center because I've got 10,000 sites. I'd rather only be running 15, 20 of them. Ideally, I'd find preferably a cloud solution for running those, so I don't even have to have them in my data center. So there's a whole element around the manageability for large numbers of clusters that becomes very different to what data center infrastructure and robo kind of use cases are used to when you come out to that vast scale of edge. And that's where I see some of the differences between enterprise technology and cloud technology kind of start to play into this discussion of what's the right thing for your edge.
Yeah, and if you think about, I mean, I completely agree, Al. If you think about it, the way that systems have been designed for years and years and years have been for data center and cloud. That's where the money's been. That's where vendors go. Let's go get as much market share as we can selling to cloud and large data center. And the technologies that exist are awesome and they work great, but they're dependent on either a 3-node or some of them do have witnesses, but these witnesses are in the data path. And that's the technical thing I wanted to mention here, is that the core of the reason why we're different is that we're proud to say that we don't do network RAID or erasure coding, however you want to, talk. There's different ways of doing it, but these data center class, cloud class storage and HCI solutions, they scale across hundreds of nodes. So they have this complicated erasure coding that works for the data center. Once you try to do that at the edge and then do a remote witness, you can, but that remote witness is still in the data path. So now you're sending all of your local IOs, all of your credit card transactions, all of the information from the wind farm, whatever it is not just staying local, it's also having to go to the cloud and back. So that's just not cost inducing. I don't know if that's the right word, cost enabling either, right? So with the way that we do things, it's a simple synchronous mirror locally. So the data is really fast, really local. And then the remote witness is just a heartbeat, right? We're just checking, are you alive? Are you alive? Are you alive? And if we don't get an answer, then we know how to coordinate things from the cloud. That's simply put, that's how we do it.
There's another aspect to this too, and I think that again, a lot of solutions that are kind of brought from the data center to the edge are kind of they're over engineered. There's a lot more hardware in there. My first edge environment that I was exposed to was a retailer, and they had a fiber channel SAN with a fiber channel switch with a multi-controller storage array. And they put these in retail stores. and it was, let's say, fairly expensive. As you've heard, if you've been listening to Utilizing Edge this whole season, and if you tuned in for Edge Field Day, a lot of companies are, well, let's say they're not doing that. What they're doing instead is they're using software, what's called software defined, basically software running on commodity hardware. You heard Bruce just mention hyperconverged. The idea is that instead of having specialized hardware to do things like controlling storage devices, you have software that does it on standard PC stuff. We've talked about our Intel NUCs quite a lot, but of course, there's a lot of other x86 type and ARM type PC stuff that's deployed out there. And in all these cases, essentially, what the result is that you have an inexpensive piece of hardware that you're deploying out there. And in some ways, this makes it easier to deploy redundant hardware, because essentially, if you're deploying a redundant device that costs $50,000, well, then that's a big expense. But if it's a $500 device, then it's a lot less of an expense. Now, it's still an expense because you may have to buy 1,000 of them, but it's not quite so bad. And I think that that's another aspect here. Most of the products that we're looking at here are either software or incredibly inexpensive hardware.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would say that this may not be unanimous agreement across the table here, but I would say for edge use cases, and I'm thinking small sites. This isn't hundreds. This is a small site. They've got 10, 20 VMs they need to run. The days of the 3-tier architecture are gone. Like, they're not going to buy a couple of servers and fiber channel and an external SAN. I mean, believe it or not, we still see customers running in that way. And when we show them, guess what? You can take a couple of servers these days. I'm not an investor either way, but I'm hearing AMD's doing quite a good job with performance these days. But it doesn't matter, Intel or AMD. Take 2 servers, super high powered. You can get plenty of storage in them. You don't need the expense of that third thing, that SAN. To manage, to pay for. And by the way, it's still a single point of failure, right? You still have 3, you have 2 servers and you have this thing, it can still fail. And then, both servers are gone, right? So I'm saying, it's a long-winded way kind of to say that hyper-converged, what you're talking about, software defined, 2 servers, use the internal storage, that is here today. It's not everywhere at the edge, but it's definitely heading in that direction.
So, Bruce, you talked about edge sites that have half a dozen virtual machines. What do you see in those virtual machines? Because we hear a lot of noise from the everything's containers in Kubernetes part of the world, but I suspect your experience of what a lot of customers are running at the edge is not all the latest and greatest, because although the future's here, it's not evenly distributed. Are you seeing customers that just want to run containers that are looking at highly available solutions, or are you seeing what I'm expecting is a much more mixed population of applications at the edge?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Al. So I'd say this. Primarily, what we still see is it's a virtualization world at the edge. Hypervisors are everywhere at the edge. It's mostly I was going to say Microsoft. It's mostly VMware. It's Microsoft is doing a great job, but it's some it's some Microsoft, and then KVM is making a play, right? There are some end users that are technical enough, happy with open source, and they'll go with Linux KVM build out there. But containers are not mainstream at the edge yet, but we definitely are talking to a lot of customers about it, because as you both know, containers are very popular in the cloud and in the data center. So guess what? The software developers, they don't think about the infrastructure at the edge. All they know is the next retail application is going to be a container, right? So the IT folks, the infrastructure team that's building the next generation edge, they know that they have to be ready for containers. And in fact, we do have customers doing it today. And typically the way we see it running today is they're simply running containers inside of a VM. And that's perfectly fine way to do it. The purists will say it's not the best way, and long term, everything should be containers, so you don't have the extra layer of the hypervisor. We'll get there eventually, but for now, and I would say at least the next 5 years, you're going to see a mix of both.
And we're definitely going to see more and more containers. I think. I mean, anyone who's actually experienced this. I mean, from my perspective, whether it's on-prem, cloud, or edge, I don't want to run things not in containers because of the benefits that containers give you in terms of being able to create the exact correct software environment for whatever the application is, and it's known good. I'm looking at you, Python. I'm looking at you. Everything that I run is I convert it into a container. And I'm seeing the same with, at the edge with Kubernetes. I mean, we talked with Brian and with some of the other companies about this as well. Kubernetes gives us a common language, a common concept for deploying applications, whether they're on-prem, in the cloud, or at the edge. So Kubernetes is going to be at the edge, but it's not going to be used at the edge the way it's used in the cloud. It's going to be used at the edge as more of a deployment and a language for applications, in my opinion. You think so, Al?
Yeah, absolutely. So fundamentally, I see Kubernetes or containerization, not necessarily Kubernetes. I have mixed feelings about the overhead of running Kubernetes at each site, but definitely containers is the mechanism for software distribution. I think that's the thing that Docker got really right with containers. And now as I'm building applications, I'm choosing to package them as Docker containers, and I find that so much easier than having to install dependencies on every server where my application needs to run. So I think, increasingly as new applications are being built, they're being built in containers. But returning to Bruce's point, there is always a really long tail of applications that are built for containers. And until there's a mass extinction event that cuts off that long tail, we're going to see them. We may see a decrease as the cost for running them continues to increase, and then containers become more cost effective. And I think I'd love to see more of these edge platforms doing more integrated containers. And last time I talked with Bruce was for the GigaOM report on hyperconverged infrastructure, and they were in the radar for edge hyperconverged infrastructure. And there was sort of a separation between VM-focused and container-focused application vendors in there. And it was an interesting thought about which is best for which use case.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say about containers, if you take this another step, is we talked about container usage for cloud and data center, and it's going to make its way to the edge eventually. Think about, though, the edge isn't everything. Obviously, there's another group we haven't even talked about today, which is small businesses, small and medium business. They might have one site, they might have five. They have the same pain points that we've been talking about today. They want high availability. They want to be able to run all of their local apps with 100% uptime. They don't have budgets. They don't have IT people at their locations. Containers are probably a long way away for them, right? Because they just don't have the skill set to do it. They don't have an IT team in up in a data center somewhere pushing containers to them. So just another example that I probably see the container world. It's going to take a while to be pervasive everywhere, particularly in the SMB world. That's probably going to be even longer, I would think.
Yeah, and particularly in the edge world, I'll point out too, because that's the thing. As long as you need one virtual machine, then you need a hypervisor at the edge. And there are so many applications, just like we saw in the VMware space in the data center. One of the superpowers that VMware brought, and now modern hyperconverged and other virtualization platforms bring, is the ability to basically take that old thing and run it on this new thing. And that's even more true in the edge, where you may have an application that not only is it not containerized, it's not really intended to be run on a virtual machine, but you can run it on a virtual machine because it's none the wiser. And so I feel like that's actually a reason that we're going to need virtualization at the edge, even though we're using containerization for more modern apps.
Yep, completely agree. Completely agree. Yeah, it's one thing that you mentioned it just something just jumped into my head about using existing infrastructure, and that's another thing that we see is edge. I'll just say it, Edge is cheap, right? They can't afford an extra $500, let alone $2,000 per site because it adds up fast. So a lot of times when they're making this HA decision, can I afford it? Can I afford it? The thought process has always been, okay, I got a single server, and I can think of a lot of customers that we've had this conversation with. Got a single server. Can I afford to go to 3? That's a big jump. Can I even afford to go to 2? That's a big jump. One of the things that we do because of the way we do things, synchronous mirror, it's not erasure coding. We're allowing customers to cluster different types of servers, different brands, different models, different ages. It doesn't matter as long as they can run the same version of the hypervisor. So there's another example of keeping customer costs down is they can leave their server in production, roll a new one in, cluster them together, and away they go. They've added HA for the cost of one server instead of 2 or 3. So that's another little benefit of going with a 2-node HA solution at the edge.
So you might see that fit with budget cycles where one of the 2 nodes gets replaced every 2 years or 3 years,
Right.
and you can just do this rolling thing rather than having to do the whole bulk update. And of course, you're then doing it as a failover between 2 nodes. Failover from the oldest node to the newest node, retire the old one, put in a newest node.
Yep.
That could be very cost effective for spreading that cost over the years. Particularly here in New Zealand, where we like a low-cost solution, and so we'll retain servers for 5 to 7 years, particularly in the provinces where I am.
Yeah, we may actually see a situation, Al, to that point where companies are basically going to use the stuff until it falls over and then dispose of it. And in a situation like that, you're almost guaranteed not to have the same hardware on both nodes, because it's almost impossible to imagine a situation where 5 years from now, you're going to be able to buy the same node. Something's going to be different.
Now you are heading towards the cloud economics of run it until it fails and replace it when it fails, or maybe a little ahead because you probably want to have continuous availability through that failure.
Are you seeing that though, Bruce? That kind of situation where companies are basically running it until it falls over and fails over, and then replacing it?
Yeah, we do see some of it. I would say it's more on the smaller company side. Our large customers that have thousands of sites, they have pretty tight protocols. But I would say 4 years, 5 years is pretty common in those environments even. But I would say, yeah, we do have customers that get every day that they can out of a server. Yeah, so you see some out there for 6 or 7, but I'd say for the big ones, it's probably you're not going to see it go past 5. That's what I've seen.
As we're heading towards the close, I want to really bring up the idea that it continues to be build the right solution for the problems that you have. And so this idea of having a highly available solution as being really cost effective just adds another tool you can use to solve the problems for the organization with the right piece of technology. Sometimes the right technology is a single node that will fail and will have an extended outage because that fits the business risk. Sometimes that risk is unacceptable, and so you need a multi-node cluster, maybe 2 nodes. Sometimes you need something bigger. The edge isn't just a single solution for a single problem. And I think knowing the possible solutions is really important. Bruce, have you got anything to bring this one home as well?
Yeah, no, I would just say, first of all, thanks for including me in this conversation. As you can tell, like I'm quite passionate about this topic, particularly for edge. I see nothing but growth of edge computing. I would even go so far as to say that we're starting to see cloud applications and cloud decisions coming back to edge because they're realizing the cloud is very, very expensive. So I see this problem getting worse. It's getting bigger. There's going to be more customers, more opportunity to think about how do I run applications locally at the least cost with high availability. So I love talking about this stuff. I'm glad you brought me on here. We will be hopefully continuing this conversation at Edge Field Day coming up in July, which we're excited about. But yeah, it's been fun. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have you. And I have to say, too, I think it's interesting, in the discussions that we've been having here on utilizing Edge, as well as Edge Field Day, and of course, the roundtable discussions that we've done as well on this topic, it occurs to me that edge is sort of a forcing function for us to reevaluate some of the decisions we've made, just like cloud was, just like the intense focus on automation and everything as code in the cloud forced us to reevaluate a lot of the things that we were doing in the data center. Edge is forcing us to reevaluate a lot of the decisions that we might make. And I think that we're coming up to a much more interesting solution, and one that, so far, a lot of technologies are kind of trickling into the edge from cloud and from on-prem data center. But I think over time, some of the lessons that we're going to be learning here are going to be trickling right back out. And we may be starting to say, maybe we shouldn't do this or do that. Maybe we should invest in this, high-end piece of hardware when we can do it in software. I mean, that's kind of one of the messages of cloud as well. So it really is an interesting conversation. And I really appreciate you hopping in here, Bruce.
Yeah.
Before we go, where can we connect with you and continue this conversation?
Well, I love to chat with you, Stephen and Al, anyone in the industry. We will be attending Edge Field Day, where it's going to be a nice open format, broadcast live. So we hope that we can take questions from the attendees in the room, plus anyone else listening. So let's have some fun with Edge Field Day in a couple weeks, couple months, 6 weeks, something like that. Yeah, it's awesome.
Al, how about you? Where can people connect with you?
You can find me online as DemitasNZ, both on Twitter and also as demitas.co.nz on the intertubes. I'm going to be at VMware Explore in Las Vegas later in the year, and if you're in Europe, you can catch me at VMware Explore in Europe much later in the year too.
And as for me, of course, you can find me here at Gestalt IT. You'll find me at Edge Field Day. Also, of course, we do have our Tuesday on-premise IT podcast, as well as our Wednesday news rundown. So thank you for tuning in for Utilizing Edge, part of the Utilizing Tech podcast series. If you enjoyed this discussion, please give us a subscription. You'll find us in all your favorite podcast applications. And maybe check out gestaltit.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. But if you are interested in show notes, and we've been doing a lot more expansive show notes for this season, head over to utilizingtech.com. You'll also find us on Twitter and Mastodon at Utilizing Tech. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.